Okay, this is QRAZ Radio, and tonight we have Shelly Harrison with part 3, session 3, whichever,
Yeah.
on the United States Constitution. I'm not going to be saying much tonight. Going to turn it over to Shelly and let her just do her thing.
Okay.
Okay, Shelly, it's all yours.
Sounds good. If you'll open up the presentation there. All right. So the last couple sessions that we have gone through, we've talked about how our Constitution was founded. We talked about the Articles of Confederation and what that was as basically a contract between all the states. And it was a loose fitting contract. And there was some infighting with the states. And so some states were stronger than other states. And there was arguments over the borders and arguments over commerce. And it became evident that our states needed to establish a central government. Our forefathers, as we had mentioned before, were very hesitant about a strong central government, what we call the federal government today. So they enumerated a number of powers to the government, and that was specific to what they could and could not do. Well, what we're going to talk about beginning today and through the next session is our Bill of Rights. And so if you'll go to the next slide, before we get to that, I want to always let you know, if you're a new viewer, I am a volunteer with the Convention of States Grassroots Movement. And what that is the largest grassroots organization in American history. And we have millions of volunteers just like me all across the United States that are working to bring self-governance back to the forefront and power back to the states and the people where it belongs. For far too long, unelected as well as elected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. have been allowed to make decisions that impact millions of Americans. And that is absolutely not what our forefathers intended. The federal government, our forefathers intended that the federal government would be a service to the states. It was created by the states for the purpose of being a service to the states and between the states, and to be subservient to the states. So the framers of the Constitution gave us the gift of Article 5, which I talked about in the last session. The gift of Article 5, should our government ever become too strong, too overbearing, or even tyrannical. And this section gives Congress the ability to propose amendments to the Constitution and the states to ratify those amendments. And it also gives the states the ability to make those proposals and ratify, completely outside of the power of Congress, the executive branch, or the judicial branch. So what we're working towards is getting 34 states willing to call a convention. We have 19 states that have passed the resolution as of today. As I think I mentioned it before, we have 4 states that are really on the cusp of becoming the next 4 states to ratify the amendment or ratify the resolution within their state houses to call a convention of states. And so we're looking to do that. And you'll see in bold down there a statement from me that I believe is crucial for each and every one of us to look at it from the perspective of as citizens, regardless of whether you're with a Democrat party, the Republican Party, Independent Party, or a combination, or whatever your party affiliation is. We are all stewards as citizens of this great country. We are all stewards of the Constitution. And truly, it is up to each and every one of us to protect and defend the liberties and freedoms that we hold dear, so that we might pass those along to the next generation to do the same. And before we move to the next slide, just want to point out that website there, the conventionofstates.com. Go there to learn a little bit more about our mission. And also, there's a petition out there you can sign if you feel that you'd like to see term limits or fiscal responsibility with our federal government. Go sign that, because our legislators do see that and hear our collective voice. So next slide. Okay, so this week, the scripture that I would like to highlight is in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. For you have been called to live in freedom, but do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but rather use your freedom to serve one another in love. And I hope that as American citizens that you look at it from that perspective. I think a lot of us have grown up in the, instant gratification culture. And I think if we turn back to God and learn that we should be serving one another, that it would behoove us and help our great country. So next slide. Okay, so for today's agenda, I'm going to overview each of the original 10 amendments. This is known as our Bill of Rights. As of today, there are 27 amendments. The original 10 is what our first Congress put together after they completed the Constitution of the United States. And so these were added as part of our original Constitution. So let's go to the next slide. And next slide, sorry. Most of what I'm getting here, you will find on the constitution.congress.gov. And so you can go to the next slide there. Okay. So what is the Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights establishes protections to us, the people, not from the government, but protections for us against the government. So in 1789, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were passed by Congress and added to the original Constitution. Most of these were crafted primarily by James Madison, and this happened during George Washington's presidency and in response to the criticism of the newly adopted original Constitution. There were two schools of thought. The first was Federalists. These were folks that were concerned that by listing specific rights, that inherently those rights would be limited. There was much debate and argument back and forth between the Federalists and the second group, Anti-Federalists, and they were concerned that by not listing rights, that the people's rights would never be conserved. And so there was much debate, much discussion, and the first 10 amendments were passed. And so this helped by continuing the continuation of the future amendments. Our forefathers knew that that the Constitution and even the first 10 amendments were not perfect, that they should be allowed to grow and expand as our society grew and expanded. And the framers understood that for a system of federal government to last, that the government needed the ability to adapt as future circumstances dictated. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to look first at that First Amendment. If you're like me, I prior to doing this volunteer work with Convention of States, I could maybe list the first two for sure, and maybe, a couple of additional amendments or Bill of Rights, but I couldn't list everything. And so what I plan to do is go through very methodically and highlight each and every one of the 27 amendments known as our Bill of Rights. And hopefully by the end of these sessions, you'll have a good broad overview and understanding of how we came to these amendments, and then be able to understand them as you read through your Constitution. So Amendment 1 is the freedom of speech, the right for peaceable assembly, what we know as peaceful protesting today, and then religious protection. So these are, again, not rights that are granted by the federal government. They are not granted by the federal government. They are granted by God and protected from the federal government to the people. So this amendment restricts Congress from making any laws that infringe upon the people's right to free speech, to the press, the right for peaceful assembly, and it restricts Congress from making any laws that establishes a state religion or prohibits the free exercise of religion. So know this, that in that day and age, and into today as well, countries have often throughout history made state religions or abolished religion altogether in order to maintain their tyrannical control. And that was first and foremost something that our first Congress and our forefathers abhorred, and they wanted to prevent from ever being restricted. The Second Amendment is the right of the people to keep and bear arms. The protection of the people's right to bear arms for defense of themselves and the state, it traced back in part to the English Bill of Rights of 1689, which allowed the English to have arms for their defense. Subsequently, at some later date, that was taken away. During the founding of America, citizen militias were drawn from local communities to provide for the common defense. Standing armies of professional soldiers were viewed with suspicion. If you are familiar with wall builders and David Barton, I had an excellent presentation by David Barton some time ago, whereas he described in early America, no one called George Washington and said, hey, we're being invaded over here in our town or county. Come and bring the troops and defend us. No, they didn't do that. They called the men together with their arms into the community houses and churches and prepared for defense of their own communities. And this is the purpose of the people's right to keep and bear arms. With Amendment 3, this is restrictions on quartering of soldiers in private homes and it protected the people from having to open up their homes for government armies to come in and take over their home. The practice of quartering soldiers actually dates back to at least the Roman Republic and was used as a tool of oppression and a source of income. Another great reason for the Second Amendment, the right for the people to keep and bear arms. Next slide, Dale. So let's look at Amendment 4 next. This is protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Many of us are familiar with this, and it protects our rights as the people to be secure in our homes, our papers and effects, and protection from unreasonable search and seizure without a warrant or without probable cause. We are all pretty familiar with this. The colonists held that English political thought, where every man's house is his castle, they